So a couple of weeks ago, people were asking about people like Ted Seth Jacobs and others. I don't remember who else was mentioned, and we got some feedback from someone who'd studied with Ted Seth Jacobs, and a fairly lengthy one, which I appreciated, and gave some more insight and background into what he's doing. And I'm going to, but it gives me an opportunity, a portion of it. It gives me an opportunity to talk about what we're doing, which is kind of the point here. But I wanted to thank Keith for this. And after he says a few things, he says, talking about Ted Seth Jacobs, for instance, he'd look at a doll, and he's describing something he saw with the gentleman chatting about painting, like we're doing. For instance, he'd look at a doll painted by an impressionist, and they may summarize the doll into a series of a couple dozen brushstrokes. They would accurately describe the drawing, value, and color in the fewest possible strokes. Well, Ted would look at that and say that reality doesn't look like brushstrokes. And thus, there's a lot of information being left out of the painting. Therefore, the Impressionist brushstrokey painting is not really representing nature. And this is a really nice follow-on of both the Ted Seth Jacobs thing and also the question about the representational painting and the idea of music in the painting. So it's not really representing nature. So he'd try to paint the doll exactly as he saw it, not simplifying it into a series of simplified brushstrokes. Thanks, Keith, again. I think that's really classic, you know, and I am of a similar bent, and that what I mean by that is to say I know the difference between truth of one kind versus truth of another. You'll even find, for example, Ang talking about how color actually doesn't want to be, this is a very poor phrasing, doesn't want to be linearized. He talks about a conflict between color work. And we're talking about a guy born in the 1780s, so he's talking about a conflict between color work and his form of drawing, which is the classic sort of academic. He sort of defines academic, and I'm not this, and that's what. But this is a different discussion. The idea of the realist, but nevertheless, let's make that one point at a time. This is the first part of that thing is a couple dozen brushstrokes. There is a conversation about efficiency in painting that goes on, and Degas will talk about what a painting is actually a good painting when it's in harmony with itself. Not when the number of brushstrokes make it look like the most realistic thing you ever saw. And yes, I still hear you. And what Ted Seth Jacobs is saying is he's talking about realism is really realistic if you have brushstrokes. Well, I had exactly the same problem as a student at the art students. Like I was studying with an impressionist, Robert Brackman, which a number of modern realists did. People my age had studied with the guy. A lot of us did. And who eventually, by the way, moved over and became more linear draftsmen, or became skilled at least in all aspects of draftsmanship. And in my case, thank you to R.H. Ives Gamble. I should say thank you very much to R.H. Ives Gamble. But the idea of the fewest strokes, et cetera, you know, when you're painting, as I said, as an impressionist, and the visual impression is always intended to be true, but it's not intended to be unlimited. It's not intended to be realism in the sense of getting it all literally. So I go back a statement, though. I'm sorry, I forgot what I was doing. Brackman there. So in the Brackman class, I remember sitting in front of the model with these broken color paintings, which is what we were doing, searching for light effects, and realizing that the wall, this smooth, slick, gray, battleship gray wall of the Art Students League, in my painting, looked like a field of gray clover or something. Like it was very textured, you know. And I was very unhappy with that. In terms of my attempts were to make a thing look like, I mean, which I think is the basis of virtually everybody who ever gets into painting, unless you're just start as an art idea guy. But most of us are interested in the look of nature, the truth, making something out of nothing, out of a few colors of paint, making the truth in front of us, and powering that up, you know, making it look like a person, making, you know, all those things. So that's an element of what we all are, especially as you're realists. So I was that guy, and I immediately saw the need to have color movements simultaneously with smoothness of a wall, because I could see both in the wall. If you're an impressionist, you're trained to see all the color and to see color movement. So that's a pretty, that's the same problem, the same thing as what Ted is saying. And he might have even been at the Art Students League reacting, even maybe in a conversation with his students, against broken color, because so often it means it destroys, for example, the smoothness of skin, which you see in Monet. But so much of this is centers around what the calling is. So the truth, and it is a funny thing. The truth, once you've sat before nature and you're drawing forth what's there, your job isn't to go from left to right and noodle it until it's exactly a photograph. That is, to my mind, the deficiency of a lot of for some people, of some people's way of thinking, who are part of the new realism. But Degas would say specifically, a painting is not done because you crossed all the T's and dotted the I's. The eyelashes are all in; it must be done. Because there's no end to the possible stuff you can keep adding and adding and adding if that's your goal. But what goal is that? What aesthetic is that? Now, arguably, when you're speaking as a teacher, it's because you're talking to a student that you're saying certain things. And that's a funny thing for me to say, except your first job as a student is to be a master of the look of nature in front of you, right? So from that point of view, there's no difference between what I or Ted Seth Jacobs might say. But the worry, of course, is that you'll get into your mind that the central goal of a, quote, realist is to get realism. And that's probably the most fundamental error of a young person, when you realize it's not satisfying. This is that search for music. It's a search for the very word aesthetic and realism are in war with each other. Literalism, I mean, like literally copying what's in front of you, dotting T's, crossing I's again, and not having an aesthetic. So as long as your job as a student is before you, then let's make it the job of when the wall is smooth, let's be smooth, and all those sorts of things. And when the color can only be made by having the color broken, let's do those. And when you're not getting the light effect, let's get that. That's all the job of a student powering up the truth in front of them. And one of the reasons I teach like the Boston School is because they have all the horses pulling at once for the student. They actually are trying to get you to see light effects, to see form, to see color movement, to see the play of all the different elements simultaneously, and figuring out what then you would have to do to begin to be a master of that sort of thing. But again, now let's stop away from that again. That my point that I was making with relation to Degas, that Degas had a picture, it's not finished when you've dotted all the T's and crossed the I's. It's finished when the thing is in harmony with itself, when there's color harmony, when there's linear harmony, when the form is playing in a conversational way with the rest of the forms. So now you're in a place that's actually a little different. Now, the reason I'm saying all that stuff is to get to the idea of this word brushstrokey. Brushstrokey as a style is one of the most, to me, one of the most distressing things. I don't have any problem with brushstrokiness per se, in the goal of the masterful expression of the beauty that you see before you. But I find a huge amount of brushstrokey thing that's happening is showing off and sort of trying to draw attention to yourself at the expense of nature itself. Now, I'm not judging anybody. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular. And I'm not a guy who hates brushstrokes. I mean, Boldini is probably a case in point, though, where you're talking about a guy who strokes the life out of pictures, so all you can see is Boldini after a minute. You can no longer see the truth in front of you. You see Boldini. And some people would argue that that's the whole point, right, isn't it? But no, self-expression is actually never at the mercy, never puts truth and beauty at its mercy. That's the beauty of what you see in front of you. It's never at the mercy of what you feel like you want to say today. And you just bring up nature and abuse her and right in the public eye. I mean, it's not exactly but that's a long and fascinating discussion that we're beginning to have right now. But yes, when it comes to a student, you don't want the student going around putting fakey little brushstrokes down. I remember an interesting story where a young woman apparently did that with a cast drawing that she was doing in front of Tarbell, and he asked her why she wasn't drawing the hair with as much care and proper shape making and all that sort of stuff as she had made the rest of the head. And she said, "Oh, that's just the hair. I didn't think I should have to bother about that." And his comment was that, well, if the sculptor could bother about it, maybe if Michelangelo could bother to have sculpted each of those parts, maybe you could trouble yourself to actually draw each of those parts. Well, she had done a strokey little hair-like marker thing, okay? Obviously, that's in the category of something a teacher ought to run down and say, no, that's not what we're doing here. And it's inapplicable in a student's job. Your job is to make it as like as you can. I think Paxton actually winds up being a really good initial model for a student. You might argue more so than the rest of the Boston school. But in the end of the day, he's not more aesthetic than the rest of the Boston school. So you may see Benson, for example, and I have showed in the past those three girls sitting in the woods, and you could call that a brushstrokey painting, but the truth in that painting is just staggering. But is every truth in that painting? And so that's an interesting question where you're actually having this discussion, is that really representing nature? And the answer is, of course, it's really representing nature. It's representing nature, but not every single fact of nature. It's actually drawing forth some very specific things for us to say, be able to look with the poet, yes, let's say the poet, to look with the poet and hear him summarize something we all should have seen, but won't see if it's photographic. And that's where you can. It isn't truly license. The element of truth. I mean, it's like, no poet is going to get away with writing crappy, stupid things because it sounds pretty. Things that are false. So there's no way in the world that the Boston School guys are in that category. They paint true. And that's each one of them express those goals. They don't go around knocking off fakey, likenesses. Their edges where they articulate them are true, but they're there for a reason. But they don't then go on and paint every single little thing, right? Because that's the model that they have before them of what makes representation. So you said that Ted would try to paint the doll exactly as he saw it, not simplifying it into a series of simplified brushstrokes. I mean, oversimplifying them, So the gestural markings, they don't amuse me. I mean, we did that at the art students' league. I never valued that ultimately. I mean, we did everything that they were suggesting we do, and there was virtually no value in it. Drawing what you see, making it as like as you can the first time was always the model that made more sense to me as we acquired that via the conversation of Bonnat, for example, the academic Bonnat. So let's see if there's one other. I think there's one other thought. Yeah. So yeah, I think we're on the same page, and I really do appreciate, Keith, for you getting back to me with that lengthy comment without getting too upset with me. It isn't my goal to separate us from each other, but actually the knowledge, is in the conflict of ideas. Certainty is in the conflict, is where you see two ideas that seem to be different from each other, being set off against each other. You can begin to say, oh, I see how this is true. So I really value these comments from individuals that have been working, for example, with Ted Seth Jacobs, and I really do respect what he's done, what I've seen of his motives and all those sorts of things. So thank you very much, Keith, for that. And I think what we'll be doing next week is picking up a related subject coming from Jack, and I'm trying to remember which one it was, but the question of detail in painting comes right up on the heel of this, so it's a very good one. All right. Thank you very much. Do like, share, subscribe, do all those wonderful things to help us to stay aware that you're there, and appreciate it. See you in a couple days.